And the first sugya I would like to discuss is the approach of the Chatam Sofer and Noida B'Yehuda, the interaction between Halacha and Kabbalah. How much relevance does Kabbalah have in halachic ruling? And the Chatam Sofer and the Noida B'Yehuda have a very similar approach, but let's start from the fundamentals. Siman Chof Hey, in Hilchas Tefillin, Mogen Avram Sif Kotten Chof, Mishnah B'Riyah Sof Kotten Mum Beis, both quote Knesset Agdoila. And what they quote from the Knesset Agdoila are 4 or 5 fundamental rules about the interaction between Halacha and Kabbalah. Number 1, Leis man de palig, agreed upon by everyone. When there is a contradiction, a stira between Halacha and Kabbalah, Halacha would always have the upper hand, and Halacha would override Kabbalah. Number 2, even when there is no contradiction between Halacha and Kabbalah, Kabbalah is not mandatory. We cannot force people to adhere to Kabbalah. Halacha is obligatory. Kabbalah is not. Rule number 2. However, when there's a stira between Halacha and Kabbalah, and the Kabbalah are machmir, then we adhere to Kabbalah. Rule number 3 seems to contradict rule number 2. Rule number 4 and 5. If we have a ruling that is based on Kabbalah, and Halacha does not relate to the question, doesn't support nor negate, or if there's a machlokes and paiskim, and a machlokes which was not decided, then we adhere to Kabbalah. So some of these rules seem to contradict one another. If there's a machlokes and paiskim, then we let Kabbalah decide which of the two is the accepted ruling. When there is no isyaxus in the paiskim, then we follow Kabbalah. When there's a contradiction or a machlokes between Kabbalah and Halacha, if the Mekabalim are machmir, we follow the Mekabalim. But rule number 2 is we can never impose Kabbalistic ruling. Only Halacha is mechayev and not Kabbalah. So mi'ikore havi amina. For many years, my interpretation was this. Sometimes there's a source in Kabbalah for a halachic idea, halachic concept, halachic ruling. But the approach is not the classical halachic approach based on Shas, based on the Rishonim, based on Svara, but rather based on Kabbalistic principles. But the essence of the ruling is halachic. In that case, sometimes we do impose Kabbalistic ruling. However, when al pi Kabbalah we find a ruling that has nothing to do with halacha, then that is not enforceable. That is not mandatory. And I want to give 2 mishalim, 2 examples. Siman Yutes, there's a machlokes, the Mogen Avram and the Ari. Well, let me give you a little bit of background. The Beis Yosef was the first and foremost and the greatest, that brought the Zohar HaKodesh, the Kavod Gadol, into the Beis HaMedrash. And many Seifim in Shulchan Aruch are based on the Zohar, which is unprecedented. No major posek did it before the Beis Yosef. The Beis Yosef learned the Zohar, and many of his decisions are based on the Zohar. We will have a few examples tonight. The Magen Avraham did the same with Kisvei Ha'ari. And it is very common in Magen Avraham that he quotes Ksavim. When he quotes the Ksavim, he means Kitvei Ha'ari. But the Magen Avraham not always agrees with the Ri. And one outstanding example is in Siman Yutes. The Magen Avraham brings, according to the Ari, one should wear tzitzis by night and sleep with tzitzis. The Magen Avraham disagrees. Laila lav zman tzitzis. Everybody agrees that Laila lav zman tzitzis. Ureisem oisoi uzechartem. Laila is not a zman riyah. So when the Ari HaKodesh says one should sleep with tzitzis, the Ari didn't mean to say it's a chiyuv, because according to Chazal, it is not a chiyuv. That is an example when we find a psak al pi Kabbalah, which was never meant to be a halachic psak. That's one example. Siman Reish Lamed Ches in Shulchan Aruch HaChaim, the place can bring, which once again, totally Kabbalah, that by night one should not learn Mikra. Only Torah Shebal Peh. And why? Because we find in Pirkei de Rebbe Eliezer, when Moshe was in the heavens, how did he know when is day and when is night? And one might ask, who says he knew? He probably knew, because even when he was in the heavens, he probably was Mekayim Kriyah Shema Shel Shachris V'Shel Harvis, and Tfilas HaShachar, and Tfilas HaMariv. So, how did Moshe know when is day and when is night? When a Kodesh Baruch Hu taught him Torah Shebechsav, he knew it's day. And when a Kodesh Baruch Hu closed the Chumash and he opened the Gemara, the Bavli or the Yerushalmi, he knew that it's night. So the Poskim and Reish Lamed Ches bring by night one should not learn Mikra. So once again, this definitely is not a halachic principle, because Mitzvahs Talmud Torah doesn't differentiate between day and night, between one part of Torah and the other. So these are two examples of rulings al pi Kabbalah which were never meant to be halachic ruling. So in these cases we say it is not mandatory. What is mechayev is halacha, and only halacha. But another example to a contrary idea is Tefillin and Chol HaMoed. Machlokes the Rosh and the Rashba, which the Shulchan Aruch brings, the Beis Yosef brings. Tefillin Chol HaMoed, should one put on tefillin or not? Is Chol HaMoed an ois or it's not an ois? That's a machlokes and Rishonim, and they bring many rayas from Shas. So the Shulchan Aruch brings a machlokes whether one should put on tefillin. And the Tur and Siman Lamed Aleph brings the opinion of his great father, the Rosh, with a bracha. Shulchan Aruch paskins without a bracha. The Beis Yosef says, according to the Zohar, the Tur paskins with a bracha. He brings another opinion, yesh oimrim without a bracha. And the Beis Yosef writes that he found in the Zohar that it's an aveira to put on tefillin Chol HaMoed. And therefore the Shulchan Aruch paskins, no tefillin in Chol HaMoed. And that's minig Eretz Yisrael. And whenever people ask me whether you're Litvish or Hasidish in Eretz Yisrael, you don't put on tefillin. And even a chutznik that comes to Eretz Yisrael, my psak is you don't put on tefillin. In Eretz Yisrael, the minig is in accordance to the Beis Yosef Shitta, no tefillin. So this is a very striking example in which, even though the Tur brings two opinions, with a bracha or without a bracha, the Beis Yosef comes along and he says, neither with nor without, you don't put on tefillin because of the Zohar. So this actually is a halachic discussion. The Beis Yosef says, Machriya al pi Zohar. That's an example. According to the Beis Yosef, yes, it is mandatory. It is obligatory. Because Kabbalah decides a machlokes that we have in Halacha. Unlike the question of tzitzis by night or mikra by night. However, when I check the Knesset Agdoila, Shuvas Aratbaz, Chelik Dalet, 2 different Shuvas, Lamed Vov and Siman Pei, what is clear in the fundamental sources, even though it is not clear in Mogen Avraham and the Mishnah Berurah, but they quote the Knesset Agdoila. And the Knesset Agdoila says, Kabbalah's ruling is never obligatory, even when we're dealing with a halachic issue. Which brings us to great confusion. So I want to give a brief list of psukim of the Shulchan Aruch which are based on Kabbalah. Number 1, as I mentioned before, Siman Lamed Aleph, Tefillin, and Chol HaMoed. The Beis Yosef is very adamant. You don't put on tefillin because it's an aveira. It's not only a ptur. One should not put on tefillin. That is according to the Zohar. Shuvas Marshal and Tzadik Ches says, if Reb Shimon Bar Yochai himself would come to the Beis Medrash, I would ignore him. Because Kabbalah is not part of the halachic process. So the Marshal is very adamant about this. You know, the Marshal was a big Ashkenazi zealot, in the positive sense. The Marshal was a chassid of Gedolei Ashkenaz. No one besides the Marshal would dare to say Rabbeinu Tam was much greater than the Rambam. And how do you know? Did you give them both a bchina? But that's what the Marshal writes. He is a big chassid of Gedolei Ashkenaz. So he disagrees with the Beis Yosef, and he writes very harshly, if Reb Shimon Bar Yochai would come to the Beis Medrash, I would not accept his ruling. Nitna Torah B'Har Sinai, and according to the Mashal, Kabbalah has no room in the halachic process, and that goes very much against the approach of the Beis Yosef. So that is only one example. There are 5 other examples in Hilchos Tefillin, psukim, halachas that are based entirely on Kabbalah, which is very interesting. So, Simachov Eisif Yud Aleph, the Beis Yosef says, Tefillin Shel Yad, you put on b'yeshiva, Tefillin Shel Rosh, ba'amida, based on the Zohar. Same siman, do you make the brocha al shorosh before the kricha al hayad or after the kricha al hayad? So the Beis Yosef paskins lefnei hakricha, and this is interesting. The Taz, Mogen Avraham, Mishnah Berurah say al pi ha'ari la'achar hakricha, and that is minhag u'olam. So we make somewhat of a compromise. First we're koirech al azroya, but not on your fingers. And then you put on the shorosh. That is somewhat of a compromise. According to the Beis Yosef, you put on tefillin shel yad, and before you do the krich on your forearm, put on shorosh with a bracha. This is not about the Zohar, but about kisvei ha'ari. And the Beis Yosef wasn't aware of kisvei ha'ari. But in the coming generation, Taz and Mogen Avraham, all the way down to the Mishnah Berurah, say minhag u'olam al pi ha'ari is to do the krich al shel yad before saying the broch al shorosh, but the compromise is we don't finish the kriches al ha'etzba. That is another halacha in Hilchos Tefillin, which is based, minhag u'olam is based on Kabbalah. Simachov Zayin, we're still in Hilchos Tefillin. The Beis Yosef quotes the Zohar. They need to be very makpid that the kesher shel yud should touch the bias, and it shouldn't move away from the bias. That is a sif in Shulchan Aruch, and it is based entirely on the Zohar. Siman Lamed Beis, we have a halacha that the saras shekorchen aparshiyos yirau mibachutz. 6 halachas in Hilchos Tefillin which are based entirely on Kabbalah. 5 out of the 6 on Zohar, and one of them is the Ari. Libi oimeli, that in Tefillin bimyuchad, Kabbalah has a lot to say. So most of these sources are not contradictions between Halacha and Kabbalah, but new halachas that are based on Kabbalah. How does it fit in with the Knesset Agdoila that Kabbalah is not binding? I wonder why the Mishnah Berurah quotes this Knesset Agdoila as if it is Halacha Psuke. It doesn't fit in with the Beis Yosef. As we just saw, there are many seifim in the Shulchan Aruch which are based on Kabbalah, on the Zohar and on Kisvei Ha'ari. Let's go back to Chol HaMoed. So it's a machlokes Rashba and Rosh, and Tosfos a few sources in Shas, whether we put on Tefillin Chol HaMoed or not. And the Beis Yosef Paschals according to Zohar, no. So, in my opinion, maybe this is not a real raya, a real proof that Kabbalah overrides Halacha. Maybe it is simply because the Zohar is Chazal. And Chazal come before the Rishonim. Reb Shimon bar Yochai comes before the Rosh and the Rashba. Just like we always paskin according to the Rishonim, if the Achronim have a machlokes kal v'chomer ben benoy shel kal v'chomer, we have a machlokes between Tosfos, Rosh, Rashba, which is undecided, and suddenly we find a makor mefurash in Divrei Chazal. So it is not because Kabbalah decrees, but it is the earliest source. If you find a Zohar, after all, it's Divrei Chazal. It's Reb Shimon bar Yochai. So I think the relevant question would be Zohar against Gemara, Ha'ari against the Beis Yosef, contemporaries.
The Anshe Talmud, they knew the Zohar and they ignored it. So it's mashma that they paskin that it wasn't Halacha.
When you say Anshe Talmud, you mean the
the
Tanoim and
the Amoraim. The Amoraim, they knew the Zohar.
We don't know whether they knew the Zohar. Do we have rayas that the Amoraim knew the Zohar? I don't know. The Zohar was first revealed, at least made known, 500 years ago.
By and Robert, did they wash Negel Wasser?
I wasn't there to know. I wasn't there to know. But Negel Wasser is based on the Gemara in Shabbos Kuf Ches. The Zohar is Machadish, you shouldn't go Daladamas before Negel Wasser, but the Chiyuv of Negel Wasser is not the Kabbalah. It's a Gemara in Shabbos Kuf Ches. What the Zohar is Machadish, a person shouldn't go Daladamas before Natilas Yadayim Shachas. That's the Chiddush of Kabbalah. But the Etzem Ruach Ra, that's a Gemara Masechta Shabbos Kuf Ches. That's not it. So, this is a very interesting case. So, when we deal Kabbalah versus Halacha, the relevant question would be Zohar versus the Gemara, or the Ari versus the Shulchan Aruch or the other Poskim. But when we find the machlokes on Poskim and we find the Zohar, then maybe just the fact that the Chazal have precedence before the Rishonim, maybe that is the relevant factor. So, do we find other seifim in Shulchan Aruch besides Hilchos Tefillin which are based on Kabbalah? Many. And I just want to bring 3 from Yoredeya and 2, which might be a surprise, in Even HaEzer. So Yoredeya Semesamachei. The Beis Yosef is Machadish al Pi Zohar. Gid Anosha Osa Bahanoah. It's a machlokes in the Gemara. And the Beis Yosef decides, al Pi Zohar, Gid Anosha Osa Bahanoah. The Darka Moshe the Ramo wonders. And Lachoyre, it's a Moire Diketema. He says, well, I'm Psochim Chov Beis, it's a machlokes Reb Shimon v'Chachamim. And Reb Shimon says, Gid Anosha Osa Bahanoah. Chachamim say it's mutar, Halacha ke Chachamim, Yochid v'Rab. It's the same Reb Shimon. So what do you prove from the Zohar? It's a Gemara in Psochim Chov Beis, a Braisa. Reb Shimon oime Gid Anosha Osa Bahanoah. So what did you find in the Zohar? It's a Braisa, which is bought in Psochim Chov Beis. Interesting. So the Satmar Rebbe Reb Yoel said, well, maybe the Zohar overrides Reb Shimon in the Mishnah and the Braisa, because The years that Reb Shimon was in the Mara, that is when he learned the Zohar, and then is when he grew to much greater heights than before. So Reb Shimon and Zohar has more significance and more power and more weight than Reb Shimon and the Braisa, which is a strange idea. How do we know what Reb Shimon did in the Mara? How do we know? You know, it's just a popular feeling. What does a tzaddik do in a Mara? Does he learn Gemara? In a cave? Probably he learned the Zohar. But the Tanya was a big chassid, as you all know. The Tanya writes in the Egeres HaKodesh that the Zohar, Reb Shimon composed in 2 or 3 months. That's what the Tanya wrote. And all his life, he learned what we find in Mishnah and in Tosefta, which is interesting. The Tanya writes, I guess that it took him 3 months to write the Zohar. He was 12 years in the cave, so what did he do there? Obviously, he learned the Sugya of Good Anosha. And who says that Reb Shimon in the Bryce is before the Mara and the Zohar is after the Mara? Has no source whatsoever. My interpretation of the Beis Yosef would be, and this proves a very significant point, it's the same Reb Shimon, but the Reb Shimon and Braisa is Halacha. Reb Shimon and Zohar is Kabbalah. And when there's a machlokes in Halacha, we rule in accordance to Kabbalah. Right, this is Reb Shimon, that's Reb Shimon. That's not the point. Because in the halachic criteria, Yochid v'Rabim, halachic Rabim. But if we find this idea in the Zohar, that is the decisive factor when we have a machlokes in Halacha, which is amazing, because what the Beis Yosef means to say, it overrules the klal of Yochid v'Rabim, halachic Rabim, which is a gewaldige chiddush. Yoredei Semekufa in Gimel, the Beis Yosef writes, I found a Zohar and Pashas Mishpotim that a person should never eat milk and meat in the same Suda. And therefore, even though by halachic criteria there's only an Isser, milk after meat, but meat after milk, there is no Isser. But in the same Suda, one should not eat milk and meat, regardless of which is first and which is second. That's a new halacha, gepaskind, Orachayim Kufayin Gimel, and in Hilchas Bosa B'cholav as well, in Siman Pei Zayin, Halacha and Shechanoch, which is based on the Zohar. Hilchas Mezuzah, this might be a chiddush to you, Shem Shaddai, on the outside of the mezuzah, Reish Peiches and Yoredeya, based on the Zohar. It has no other source besides the Zohar. So 3 halachas, Yoredeya halachas, which are based on Zohar. You're fully aware that under the chuppah, a chosen always gives the kala a ring to be mekadosh. Where did that minhag come from? In the Gemara, we find a mekadosh b'tamora. Person was mekadosh with a date, with an apple. I don't think any shver would be happy if his son-in-law under the chuppah would take a bunch of nuts or dates or figs and give it to the kala and say, Harayet mikudeshes li. That's not a great school for Shalom Bayis. But where does the minhag come from? And this is not a Bet Yosef, but rather a Ramah. Even Ezer Simachov Zayin Sif Aleph, Tikunei Azoyer, Tikun Hey. Does everybody know what is Tikunei Azoyer? Also Shivim Tikunim. It's one of the Sforim of the Zohar. 70 different prokim. All the 70 prokim Tikunei Zohar deal with the very first posuk in Chumash Bereishis. Bereishis Boro Elokim es hashamayim ve'es ha'oretz. 70 different interpretations on one posuk. It's just amazing. Arucha me'eretz mido. urachava miniyam. So in Tikkun Hey, the Zohar says that a person should be mekadesh isho, he should be mekadesh skala with a ring, and that is where the minig comes from. It's so interesting that the Beis Yosef doesn't bring this minig, even though the source is a Zohar, and it's a Ramah. Semekuv samach tes hilchos chalitza, say the chalitza as nun beis, Shulchan Aruch writes, and the source is the Rambam. The woman takes the shoe off the man's shoe, she throws it onto the floor. Why? As no source in Mishnah, Tosefta, Bavli, or Yerushalmi. First found in Rambam. The Beis Yosef writes, what else should she do with it? I mean, it's not her shoe. She take it home. So the Rambam writes, takes it off his foot and throws it to the floor. Interesting. And what's so surprising is, it's a Zohar in Pashas Chukas. And the Beis Yosef wasn't aware of the Zohar. And he writes, no, it's not a halacha. And the Beis Yosef brings in a Shulchan Aruch, be'ikvois Rambam. So if it's just, she has nothing else to do with the shoe, why would the Beis Yosef write it in Shulchan Aruch? Which is interesting. So these are two halachas in Even HaEzer, which are based on the Zohar, and the Beis Yosef didn't see neither of these two Zohars. They are brought by the Ramah and by other Achronim. So this is just an interesting discussion. In Aliyas Eliyahu, as well as Keser Roish, it is quoted in the name of the Gra that this entire discussion is a mistake and there could never be a stira, a contradiction between Kabbalah and Halacha. And if we find a contradiction between Kabbalah and Halacha, either you didn't get the Halacha right or you didn't understand the Kabbalah. And because it's more likely that we understand Halacha than Kabbalah, that is why we rule according to Halacha. And this is a novel approach. This is a game changer. So the Gaon assumed there cannot be a contradiction between Halacha and Kabbalah. They must go hand in hand, which is an interesting fundamental yesod. But what is the practical implication? We got something wrong. It's either you didn't learn the Halacha right or you didn't learn the Kabbalah right. And because it's more reasonable to assume that we understand Halacha than we understand Kabbalah, that is the reason Halacha overrides Kabbalah. Not because in essence they are different, because we assume that what we understand, our Halacha conclusion, is more acceptable than our Kabbalistic understanding. Aruch Shulchan Hilchos Tefillin Chof Hey Chof Tes writes Kach Mikublani. And there are a few seifim in Aruch Shulchan which I wonder, Kach Mikublani, from whom? So the Aruch Shulchan was Rav of Ardog. He was a Litvisher. Didn't he know this comes from the Gaon? Why doesn't he quote it in the name of the Gaon? I don't know. But he writes, Kach Mikublani, that la'amita shel davar, there can be no contradiction between Halacha and Kabbalah, as we mentioned. Let's get to the Noida Behuda and the Chatam Sofer. Maybe we'll deal more at length with the Noida Behuda in another shiur. But the Noida Behuda, as you know, comes out very strongly against L'Shem Yichud, that Hasidim said before performing mitzvahs. He comes out against Tzavos Reb Yehuda Chosid. So in Shuvas Noida Behuda, it is very clear that what needs to dictate our lives is Halacha and only Halacha. Chatam Sofer, we find 4 different fascinating Shuvas. Or Chaim Siman Kuf, he deals with the mitzvah of Shiluach Haken. And the opinion of the Chatam Sofer is that there is no mitzvah at all in Shiluach Haken unless you really want to eat those eggs or those little birds. The Chatam Sofer writes, if you do shiluach haken and you throw it all away, that's midas achzorius. That is cruelty. The mitzvah of shiluach haken applies only as abonim tikach lacha. You're hungry, you want to eat those eggs, or you want to eat those birds, you have a mitzvah of shiluach haken. So almost on a daily basis, people come to be mechabed me. I found a ken, and my yahud, does the Rav want to do? And I always, I give other terutzim. I don't do it. Because both the Chazon Ish and the Chatam Sofer say, there is no mitzvah whatsoever unless you have an interest in taking those eggs or those birds. Otherwise, just live and let live. Why destroy a little family? The Chatam Sofer writes, I know that in Tikunei HaZohar state that the mitzvah of shiluach haken is not because we have rachmanis on the mother bird. To the contrary, we want to pain the mother and cause her tsar. Knesses Yisrael leyoine imsala. The Jewish people are nimshel to a bird, and when the mother longs for her children and she's worried, rachmei shemayim misoirerim al bnei Yisrael shem begolus. When we tear the mother away from her little offspring, that is like a Kodesh Baruch Hu that is in Golus, and he lost his children, and he longs for his children. So the Inyan of Shiluach Haken is la'orer gaguei ho'em. And according to the Zohar writes, the Chatam Sofer, we should always do Shiluach Haken. Both the Rambam in Moed Nevuchim and the Ramban al Torah Parshas Kiseitze explain Shiluach Haken is about Rachmanas. Don't take those eggs or those little birds when the mother sees. Send away the mother to minimize her torment. But according to the Zohar, it's the other way around. So the Chatam Sofer says, we don't rule in accordance to Halacha, in accordance to Kabbalah. We totally ignore Kabbalah. And the Chatam Sofer has a kasha. According to the Zohar, how do we understand Shiluach Haken b'zman shebeis hamikdash kayim? If Shiluach Haken is la'orer, golas hashchina and golas b'nei Yisrael, but the mitzvah of Shiluach Haken is b'kol mokom or b'kol zman, even b'zman shebeis hamikdash kayim. Therefore, the Chatam Sofer decides the Zohar is narika, and it's a big pillar. The Chatam Sofer didn't see the Tikunei Zohar, because this very same question Rabbi Elazar ben Rabbi Shimon asked his father, and it's in the Tikunim. The Chatam Sofer relied on the Chavasur that quotes the Zohar, but he doesn't quote the entire Zohar. This question Rabbi Elazar ben Rabbi Shimon asked his father, if the idea of Shiluach Haken is la'orer rachamei hashchina b'nei Yisrael begolus, so why do we have the mitzvah we're not in golus? And Rabbi Shimon has explained, la'orer rachai shemayim al neshomois hatoyos, on the neshomas that are strewn about somewhere in this cosmos, and they're lost. Neshomas hatoyos, not with a test, but rather with a tov. So Rabbi Shimon dealt with this question, and he answered. So what bothers the Chatam Sofer? Obviously, he didn't see the Tikunei HaZohar. He just relied on the Chavasur before him, and he brings the Chavasur's tshuva. So this is one example. The other example is in Chatam Sofer Even Ezer Chelik Beisim and Pei Hey. Chatam Sofer deals with the question: an elderly woman, her husband died, and they had no children. Does she need to take chalitza? She says, I do not plan to remarry. So the Chatam Sofer says chalitza is all about enabling the widow to remarry, and if she doesn't want to remarry, there's no need for chalitza. So once again, the Chatam Sofer writes, I am aware that the Zohar says that the neshama of the mace has no menucha until the widow gets chalitza. And according to the Zohar, one should always do chalitza. It's not necessarily associated with remarriage. Once again, the Chatam Sofer gives his opinion. Kabbalah is not enforceable. We don't rule according to Kabbalah. Our yardstick is only halachic ruling. Chatam Sofer Orach Chaim Nun Aleph quotes a saying, his own saying, and the Chatam Sofer quotes from time to time his proverbs and his sayings. Chatam Sofer writes, Rogel ani loimer. I am used to saying, if someone confuses Halacha and Kabbalah, it's like the Isser of Kilei HaKerem. If someone confuses philosophy and Halacha, it's like Chodesh B'Shor V'Chamor Yachdo. And if he's a Manig Yisrael, then he is over an Manig B'Kilayim. Interesting. That's what the Chatam Sofer writes in Siman Nun Aleph. You should never confuse Kabbalah and Halacha, and even worse, confusing philosophy and Halacha. And if he's a Manig, then he's a Manig B'Kilayim. Munkat Sharov, Minchas Aroza Chelik Beis Emanayin Ches is very unhappy about this tshuva. And he really has a big kasha. And he quotes various different seifim in Shulchan Aruch, which the Beis Yosef based on Kabbalah. So he writes, I don't understand the Chatam Sofer. The Minchas Aroza was quite an interesting gadol. Rav Osner Zatzal Shevet Alevi Chelak Aleph Siman Beis wants to explain the Chatam Sofer. The Chatam Sofer doesn't mean that we don't adhere to Kabbalah. We shouldn't confuse Halacha and Kabbalah. And we should make it clear. The Halacha is A, but Kabbalah is B. I disagree with Rav Osner's interpretation because Hakushya b'mkoyma oimedes. There are tens of seifim in Shulchan Aruch which are based on Kabbalah and the Zohar. Are these not halacha? Are these seifim different than any other? Is there a difference between the psak of the Beis Yosef about Tefillin Chalamoid and the psak of the Beis Yosef whether that Shel Yad comes before Shel Rosh? They're both seifim in Shulchan Aruch. To me, it is clear that sometimes when we learn a tshuva, we must understand the background and the context. And this brings me to my opening comment about the Noida B'Yehuda and the Chatam Sofer. So the Noida B'Yehuda was shortly after the devastation of Mashiach HaSheker of Shabtai Tzvi, and it's still reverberated in the times of the Chatam Sofer. And maybe both the Noida B'Yehuda and the Chatam Sofer were afraid of the rapid advance of Hasidus. The Noida B'Yehuda was a big misnagid, as he makes it clear, and we'll discuss the shit of the Noida B'Yehuda and another shiur. My Rebbe, the great Kloisenberger Rebbe, used to quote from one of his Rebbeim that we see the Chatam Sofer as one of the Talmidei Baal Shem, which in reality is very far from the Metzias. He wasn't the Mesnagid like the Noida B'Yehuda or the Goen, but he definitely wasn't the Chassid. And this brings me to the last section of today's shiur. Shuvas Chatam Sofer Siman NESIVOS. So let me give some historical background. The Baal Shem Tov, primarily second generation of Hasidus, the great disciples of the Baal Shem Tov that told us, the Magid, the Mezritcher Magid, and Hasidus conquered town after town, community after community, and the Gedolim were very concerned, and we can understand their concern. Well, looking back after 300 years, obviously, Hasidus didn't turn people away from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Hasidus was the Choyme B'Tzura against the Haskalah and the Reform. But trying to understand the times 300 years ago, we could very well appreciate why Gedolim were so concerned. So Hasidim said, all our minhagim are based on the Ari. Ha'im Kain. So the Mogen of Rome Semesameches quotes the Ari. And it's in Shara Kavonis, Inyan Nusach Hatfila, in Shara Kavonis. The Ari writes, a person should never change the Nusach of his fathers or forefathers. And the Mogen of Rome quotes him as Semesameches. And why is that? Because there are 12 gates in the heavens. And the tefillas go up to a Kodesh Baruch Hu through those Sharei Shomayim. And every shar has a different nusach against the Yud Beis Shavotim. Nobody knows which Shevet he comes from, and therefore never change the nusach. So Hasidim argued, our minhagim are minhagei Ari. But tens of thousands of people left Nusach Ashkenaz and they went over to Nusach Sfarad. And the Gedolim were appalled. How could you claim to follow the Ari if en masse entire communities stopped davening Nusach Ashkenaz and they all went over to Nusach Sfarad? So where are these 12 She'orim mentioned? The last Perek in Novi Yechezkel. The very last Perek. Novi Yechezkel Metchila V'Atzoif is what Yechezkel saw in the heavens. And Yechezkel saw Masa Merkava. He saw, according to Chazal, more than any other Novi saw. What's happening up there in the heavens? And in the very last Perek in Novi Yechezkel, he speaks about the She'orim. ואלה תצורס או איור מפס צופן 514 אלוף מידו, שערו עיר על שמוי שבטי ישראל. That is the city Yechezkel sees in the heavens. ושערו עיר על שמוי שבטי ישראל, שלושה צפוינו, שער ראובן, יהודה, לוי. על פייס קדימו, שלושה שעורים, שער יוסף אחד, שער בנימין אחד, שער דן אחד. Arba Ruchas Hashemayim, Mizrach Ma'ariv Tzofen Dorim. Each of them 3 Shorim al Shemesh Shifti Yisrael. Dari says, these Shorim, these are the gates in heavens in which the tefillas go up. And every Shevet has its Nusach. So how did Hasidim explain? How did they all leave Nusach Ashkenaz, go over to Nusach Sfarad? 2 different interpretations. Fascinating. Sefer Likutei Amorim, the Maggid of Mezrich says there's a 13 shar that the Novi Yechezkel doesn't bring. So how do you know it exists? Because in Masechet Shkolim, there are 13 sha'orim in the Mikdash. And there's a Beis Mikdash Lamalo, Keneged Beis Mikdash Lamato. What is the 13 shar? That's the shar HaKoilel, and that is Nusach HaAri. So regardless of which Shevet you come from, Nusach Ari is number 13. Interesting. So why didn't the Novi Yechezkel know about that shar? He didn't see it? Tzorech. So the Maggid says 12 She'orim are for the 12 tribes, but 13 is a shar HaKoilel. And the Ari was Megala. That is Nusach Ari. Nusach the Ashkenazi, Nusach Sfarad, which is fundamentally Nusach Ari, that is number 13. So the Chatam Sofer was asked, what do you say? A person that davens Nusach Ashkenaz, could he go over to Nusach Sfarad? The Chatam Sofer writes, Sefer Likutei Amorim, I never saw the Sefer and I don't know what it is. So obviously he wasn't such a big Talmud of the Baal Shem Tov, and he totally disagrees with it. And he says, well, the Ari says there are 12 Shorim, and the Ari says one should not go over from one nusach to the other. Zera Kodesh, from the Rav Shetzer of Naftali Tzvi, he has a different suggestion, and he says, no, there are only 12 Shorim. Each nusach is a key to a gate, but there is one master key. You know, you have an office, and each pukid has a key to his room, but the CEO could open all the rooms. Security. The security has a master key that opens all the doors. So the Rav Shetzer says, well, it's unlikely to say there's a number 13. Novi Yechezkel speaks about 12, not about 13. So he comes up with another idea, the Zera Kodesh, and he says, no. Each nusach is a key to one of Shara Shamayim. But nusach ha'ari is the master key, and that opens all the gates. So that is the justification to leave nusach Ashkenaz and daven nusach Sfarad. Some Sofer doesn't like this idea, and he says you cannot switch from one nusach to another, regardless. Neither from Ashkenaz to Sfarad, nor from Sfarad to Ashkenaz. So, my feeling is that Chatam Sofer was fully aware of the Beis Yosef's adherence to the Zohar. The Chatam Sofer was afraid in his time, as the Noida Yehuda before him. And they felt that we need to bring Yiddishkeit back to the Shulchan Aruch and back to Halacha. They were afraid that we're going astray. It was the Tkufa after Shabsai Tzvi. They were afraid of Hasidus, and their hashkafa in their day and age was, we need to bring Klal Yisrael back to the Shulchan Aruch. The Gemara and the Rambam and the Shulchan Aruch and Halacha. So, that is my feeling regarding Piskei Chatam Sofer and Piskei Ha'ari.
Did the Chatam Sofer, did the Chatam Sofer ever discuss with his Rebbe why he switched to Nusach Sfard, Ibn Nosson Adler?
I'm not
Would it be
aware.
if it's a Pella? No, it's not a Pella.
Yeah, Ibn Nosson Adler was a mystery. You know, his entire personality is shrouded in mystery. The Chatam Sofer had two Rabbeim, the Aflo and Nosson Adler. So the Aflo was a Talmud of the Maggid Mezrich, but in Frankfurt he switched from Sfarad to Ashkenaz and he davened Nusach Ashkenaz. What? Yeah, in shul he davened Nusach Ashkenaz. Some say that at home he davened Nusach Sfarad, but in shul he davened Nusach Ashkenaz. And Ibn Nosson Adler davened Nusach Sfarad. Ibn Nosson Adler Bechlal, orders Hanogas were al Pi Kabbalah. So let me just mention, and this is the final note, some Sephardi Gedolim, most notably the Kaf HaChaim and the Ben Ish Chai, they say whenever there's a machlokes Ari and Beis Yosef, we paskel in accordance to the Ari and not accordance to the Shulchan Aruch. Yosef Amasha Amarti Lochem Kosov Kan, and you know this is a very broad discussion, but I hope it was an interesting psicha about the Ashkofa of the Chatam Sofer. Primarily, we also touched upon the Noida Yehuda regarding the interaction between Halacha and Kabbalah. So, thank you, and I hope we'll have many opportunities in this coming Shabbos and in Sunday to share Divrei Torah.